In the early decades of the 20th century, Germany was a nation forged in steel and ambition. Industrial dynasties rose like cathedrals of commerce, their fortunes built on the backbone of a rapidly modernizing nation. Among these titans stood the Quandts, a family whose name would become synonymous with both unprecedented wealth and unthinkable moral compromise. On November 1, 1921, Harald Friedrich Ludwig Quandt entered a world of privilege and power. His father, Günther, was already building an industrial empire. His mother, Magda, was a woman of ambition whose beauty would soon catch the eye of history's most notorious figures. But this was Germany in the aftermath of the Great War. A nation humiliated, economically devastated, and searching for someone to blame. Into this chaos would step a failed artist from Austria, and with him, the darkest chapter in human history. Harald was only 8 when his parents divorced in 1929, but Günther and Magda maintained an unusual friendship, one that would soon entangle their son in the web of Nazi power. December 19, 1931. At his mother's second wedding, 10-year-old Harald Quandt found himself in a photograph that would haunt him for life. The groom, Joseph Goebbels, soon to become Hitler's master of propaganda, the best man Adolf Hitler himself, the child in the corner, a boy who would inherit not just vast wealth, but the moral burden of his family's choices. Harald Quandt represents one of the most complex figures of 20th century Germany. He was simultaneously victim and beneficiary, child and heir, innocent and complicit. Understanding his story means grappling with the impossible moral mathematics of Nazi Germany. From 1934, Harald lived with his mother and stepfather in the heart of Nazi power. Magda had become the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich, while Goebbels orchestrated the propaganda machine that would seduce a nation into genocide. Yet even here, in this den of racial hatred, Harald showed signs of independent thinking. He openly supported the Indian independence leader Subhas Chandra Bose, a stance that raised eyebrows in a household dedicated to Aryan supremacy. Harald's support for Bose reveals something crucial about his character. Even as a teenager surrounded by Nazi ideology, he was capable of seeing beyond racial boundaries. It suggests a moral compass that, while not perfect, was distinct from his stepfather's worldview. In 1940, having passed his school examinations, Harald joined the Luftwaffe. For the next 4 years, he would serve the regime that his stepfather helped build, fighting in Crete, Russia, and Italy. It was a contradiction that would define his entire life. The boy who questioned Nazi ideology, serving in Nazi uniform. The Battle of Crete in 1941 was one of the war's bloodiest airborne assaults. Harald flew missions over the Mediterranean, witnessing the brutal calculus of modern warfare. In Russia, he saw the Eastern Front's apocalyptic brutality. In Italy, he was wounded and eventually captured by Allied forces. In 1944, Harald found himself in a prisoner of war camp in Benghazi, Libya. While he endured the hardships of captivity under the African sun, his family in Berlin faced their final, terrible hours. May 1, 1945, in the Führer bunker beneath burning Berlin, Joseph and Magda Goebbels made their final, unforgivable choice. They murdered their 6 children, Helga, Helmut, Hedda and Hyde, before taking their own lives. Harald, thousands of miles away in his prison cell, was the only one of Magda's children to survive. The murder of the Goebbels children represents one of the most chilling examples of ideological fanaticism. Harald's survival was purely circumstantial. He was saved by his absence, but that survival came with an impossible burden. Being the sole living link to one of Nazi Germany's most notorious families. Released from captivity in 1947, Harald returned to a Germany that existed only in fragments. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead or displaced, and the moral reckoning had only just begun. But for Harald Quandt, this devastation also represented opportunity. Working alongside his half-brother Herbert, Harald began the monumental task of rebuilding the Quandt industrial empire. But first, he needed an education for the new world they were creating. From 1949 to 1953, Harald studied mechanical engineering in Hanover and Stuttgart. These weren't just academic pursuits, they were strategic investments in cities where his family owned major industrial facilities. The Wirtschaftswunder, Germany's economic miracle, wasn't just about American aid or efficient planning. It was built by men like Harald Quandt who understood both the old industrial base and the new technological possibilities. They were bridge builders between Germany's industrial past and its modern future. When Günther Quandt died in 1954, he left his empire to both his sons. Harald, at 33, suddenly controlled one of Germany's largest fortunes, over 200 companies spanning textiles, pharmaceuticals, and most significantly, automotive manufacturing. The Quandt holdings included nearly 10% of Daimler, Benz and 30% of BMW, companies that would become symbols of German engineering excellence. Harald also inherited Varta, the battery manufacturer that emerged from the wartime company AFA, where forced laborers had once toiled under horrific conditions. Harald Quandt represented the new Germany, industrial, pragmatic, forward-looking. But he also carried the old Germany's burdens. The question that haunted him, and haunts us still, is whether economic success can ever truly absolve historical guilt. In the early 1950s, Harald married Inge Bandekow, daughter of the family's lawyer. She had worked as a secretary in her father's firm, a woman who understood the complex machinery of Quandt business operations. Over 17 years, Harald and Inge had 5 daughters. Despite his reputation as a committed playboy, Harald seemed to find in fatherhood something that his own complicated childhood had denied him: the chance to create a family untainted by political extremism. Harald's passion project was the Amphicar, an amphibious vehicle manufactured by his company at WWII. It was an engineer's dream, a car that could become a boat at the flip of a switch. But like many dreams, it proved commercially impractical. The Amphicar embodied Harald's personality, innovative, ambitious, but somehow not quite suited to the real world. When production ceased in 1963 due to lack of demand, it seemed to symbolize the gap between Harald's engineering enthusiasm and market reality. Harald Quandt was never just a businessman, he was an engineer at heart. The Amphicar project shows us someone who believed technology could solve any problem, even the fundamental incompatibility between cars and boats. It was naive perhaps, but also wonderfully human. December 12, 1965, Harald's private aircraft crashed during landing at Zurich Airport. By some miracle, he survived, but fate had marked him. The crash should have been a warning, but Harald Quandt was a man who believed in pressing forward. Aviation was his passion, his escape from the earthbound complexities of business and family legacy. September 22, 1967, Harald was flying over the mountains of northern Italy when his aircraft encountered severe weather. This time, there would be no miraculous survival. At 45, Harald Quandt was dead, killed in the same element that had defined both his military service and his civilian passions. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in the Quandt family story. Harald left behind 5 daughters and a fortune estimated at 1.5 billion Duchy marks, roughly $760 million in today's currency. But more than money, he left them a legacy of moral complexity that continues to this day. The Harald Quandt holding manages a fortune worth approximately $17 billion. His daughters have built upon their father's legacy, but they've also had to confront the darker chapters of their family history. My father rarely spoke about the war years or his stepfather. We knew, of course, but it wasn't something discussed at the dinner table. It was only later, as adults, that we began to understand the full weight of what we had inherited, not just wealth, but responsibility. In October 2007, a documentary called The Silence of the Quandts aired on German television. For the first time, a wide audience learned about the family's use of forced labor during World War II. Our research revealed that the Quandts were linked inseparably with the crimes of the Nazis. This wasn't passive complicity, this was active participation in a system of exploitation and murder. 5 days after the documentary aired, 4 family members announced they would fund an independent study of their wartime activities. The resulting 1,200-page report confirmed what many had suspected: the Quandt Empire was built, in part, on the suffering of forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners. We cannot change the past, but we can acknowledge it. Our father lived his entire life in the shadow of choices he didn't make, but from which he benefited. Now it's our responsibility to ensure that shadow doesn't continue to fall on future generations. Harald Quandt died as he lived, caught between worlds. He was the stepson of one of history's greatest monsters, yet he questioned that monster's ideology. He built a fortune on foundations laid with forced labor, yet he seemed to genuinely seek a different path. Harald Quandt's story is Germany's story, the impossible burden of living with an unusable past. He represents millions of Germans who weren't directly responsible for Nazi crimes, but who inherited their consequences. The question isn't whether we can forgive him, but whether we can understand him. Today, BMW employs over 130,000 people worldwide. WWII continues to produce batteries for everything from hearing aids to electric vehicles. The companies Harald helped rebuild have become symbols of German engineering excellence and corporate responsibility. But perhaps Harald Quandt's most important legacy isn't measured in billions of dollars or manufacturing statistics. It's the ongoing conversation about historical responsibility, moral inheritance, and the possibility of redemption. Every generation inherits the choices of those who came before. Harald Quandt inherited choices he never made, wealth he didn't create, and guilt he didn't earn. But he also inherited the opportunity to choose differently. How we judge those choices says as much about us as it does about him. Harold Friedrich Ludwig Quandt lived for 45 years, 11 months, and 21 days. In that brief span, he witnessed the rise and fall of the Third Reich, the devastation and rebirth of Germany, and the transformation of his family's empire from a tool of oppression into an engine of prosperity. He was neither saint nor demon, but something more complex and more human, a man trying to build a future while carrying the weight of an impossible past. In the end, perhaps that's the most any of us can do: inherit the world we're given, acknowledge its darkness, and try to leave behind more light than shadow.